The Church's defense against rival interpretations involved important questions of the organization of the Church and the authority that it recognized. The items to be discussed had their origin prior to and apart from the challenge of heresy and schism. But these items were strengthened in their development and given an anti-heretical thrust. I mentioned, first of all, developments in regard to monepiscopacy and apostolic succession. Monepiscopacy refers to the practice of one bishop at the head of a local church. And apostolic succession was the claim that these bishops succeeded to the functions of the apostles in New Testament times. The early organization of the church, attested in the New Testament and some of the earliest post-canonical writings, was that of a plurality of elder bishops in each church, assisted by deacons. One bishop, as the head of the Council of Presbyters and of the local church, is first attested in Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, at the beginning of the 2nd century. Ignatius was a local bishop, and nothing is said in Ignatius about apostolic succession or priestly function. The arrangement of the threefold ministry that he advocated, the bishop, presbyters, and deacons, became common by the mid-2nd century. Irenaeus, in the late 2nd century, Irenaeus was Bishop of Lyon in France, made the argument for the apostolic succession of bishops. A claim to apostolic succession of teachers was first made by Gnostics. The Gnostics claimed that their teaching had come by way of a secret tradition derived from the apostles through some of their disciples and then to these teachers themselves. Irenaeus countered that the apostolic faith was preserved rather in the churches by a public succession of bishops and presbyters, and not by these private teachers. The succession for Irenaeus was a succession from one holder of the teaching office in the church to the next holder of the teaching office. Later apostolic succession came to refer to succession from ordainer to ordained. But that is not true for Irenaeus. It is the succession from one bishop as the primary teacher in a church to the next bishop. And Irenaeus himself included presbyters in this succession in the teaching office. Hippolytus, in the early 3rd century, has the language not merely of succession from the apostles, but successors of the apostles. But we're not sure how much content he would have put in that terminology. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage in the mid-3rd century, puts the content of succession to functions of the apostles to this language of apostolic succession. Monepiscopacy and apostolic succession became common practice and common claims in the Greek Orthodox Church and in the Roman Catholic Church, and then later in the Anglican Church. A second line of defense against the rival interpretations represented by Marcion and Gnosticism and Montanism was an emphasis on the rule of faith and on the Apostles' Creed. Statements of each have been confused one with the other, But the rule of faith and the Apostles' Creed had different functions and took a different form. The reason for the confusion of the two is that they had a similar content, for the faith that was taught was the same as the faith that was believed. But in function, the rule was a summary of teaching or of the faith, and the creed was a confession, especially made at baptism. In form, the rule had flexibility of wording and flexibility in the items included, whereas the creed had a relative fixity in wording and content. And that standardization is characteristic of liturgical material, something that is used in the liturgy and repeated from week to week or with some frequency tends to become standardized in form and wording. And thus the creeds had a fixity about them that statements of the rule of faith did not, because you could adjust the content of what you described as the rule of faith according to the circumstances of preaching or teaching and what was required in a given situation. The third line of defense against the rival interpretations was the development of the canon of Scripture. The word canon meant standard, and then list. The church began with a canon, the Old Testament Scriptures. But now the Old Testament Scriptures were read as related to Jesus and interpreted with reference to him. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Septuagint, included some books that were not accepted by Jews into their canon. And these books, in varying numbers, came to be regarded by many Christians as canonical. And thus the larger canon that was accepted later by the Roman Catholic Church differed from the canon of Protestants who followed the Jewish limitation to those books that were found in the Hebrew Scriptures. Marcion had the first fixed collection that we know of. And because of that, some scholars have thought that the development of the canon was primarily a reaction against Marcion. However, the church would have had a canon even if there had been no Marcion. He might have speeded up the process. But the recognition of certain writings as scripture and as authoritative was something that would have happened even if there had not been a Marcion. There were stages that we can mark in the development of the New Testament canon. These stages were not reached at the same time at each place, but as we look back now, we can discern these different stages in the development of the New Testament canon. The first stage is the Scripture principle. When teachings of Christ and the apostles were put into writing, they carried the same authority that the oral presentation of those teachings had. There was the same message, whether it was oral or written. Hence, the written words had the authority of Christ and the apostles behind them. And so the Scripture principle is there at the beginning of the writing down by apostles and their associates of the teachings that they had delivered. The second stage is the canon principle. That is, the recognition that only certain writings have authority, not just anything that is written. Just because something was written did not make it authoritative. But certain writings were considered as authoritative because they represented what the apostles themselves had written or their associates had written. At this stage, there is not a negative judgment that only the known writings are authoritative. Certain works are accepted as authoritative, but you may not know all of the possibilities. You may not know all of the authoritative books. I have called this stage the open canon. Some object to that terminology because, by definition, that they say that canon means a closed canon. And in modern usage, that would certainly be correct. But I would say that prior to having a closed canon where you say only these books, you say these books, but you are not excluding the possibility that there might be others as well. The third stage is that of a closed canon. And as I've indicated, that is what many people understand canon to mean. The word canon came into use for the list of authoritative books only in the 4th century. And that coincides with what some scholars claim, that the church did not have a canon until the 4th century. But certainly many scriptures were considered scriptural, many writings were considered authoritative before this time. And in fact, there was a title for these writings in use, at least from the time of Clement of Alexandria at the end of the 2nd century. And that terminology was covenantal writings, the writings of the Old Covenant, the writings of the New Covenant. And that was the language that was used before it was finally replaced by the language of canon in the 4th century. But at this stage of development of a closed canon, these books and no others are recognized as authoritative. Some scholars claim that this is the only meaning of the word canon and deny the idea of an open canon. But certainly this stage is implicit in the 2nd stage. But whether one can speak of an open canon depends on the definition that one gives to the word canon. The term came to be used when this stage was reached in the 4th century. But what the word stood for, namely authoritative documents, was older than this use of the word to describe it. And as I've indicated, that terminology was that of covenantal writings. The 4th and final stage in the development of the canon would be the recognition of the same canon. This was somewhat slow in coming. Athanasius has our first list of the New Testament books as 27, corresponding to the recognized listing of New Testament documents today by all Christians, Catholic and Protestant alike. But there was some time before this 27 was recognized everywhere. For instance, in Syria, the writings of the general epistles were not accepted, and Revelation was not accepted until later. And the Ethiopian church included other writings in its canon and still does today. But for the vast majority, the recognition of the same closed canon is reached by the end of the 4th and beginning of the 5th century. I want to say a few words about the criteria for the recognition of certain books as canonical. The listing that I give is taken from the Muratorian fragment, variously dated either the end of the 2nd century or in the 4th century. I prefer the earlier dating, but even if it is later, these points represent ideas that were appealed to by others, although not all in one document. And so it is convenient to use the Muratorian fragment for listing criteria that applied to canonicity. And I should point out that these were standards after the fact, not criteria for making a decision. Early writers regularly refer to what was handed down, what was received. These factors that I'm going to mention were then seen as justifying the reception, but they were not employed in order to make a decision as to what should be included in the canon. The Muratorian fragment refers to the inspiration of certain writers. That was a precondition of canonicity. Canonical books were inspired writings, but not all books considered inspired were accepted as canonical. Inspiration was as broad as prophecy, and so was much broader than a limited number of writings. But certainly inspiration was a precondition. Another precondition was apostolicity. A book had to come from apostolic times and from an apostle himself or from an associate of an apostle, if not actually written by an apostle. Another standard was antiquity. That corresponds in some ways to apostolicity. The writing must not be a recent composition. Another criterion was applicability to the whole church. That is, a writing was useful to the universal church, even if written to a specific church. Churches did not have to have the same problems for the instructions to be normative for them. And even things like 1 Corinthians that had very special problems being addressed still were contained teachings that other churches found normative regardless of their situation. Another criterion was that something was read in the church. Now, other works could be read on occasion, but these were the regular readings in the assembly of the church. And then finally, something had to have right doctrine, as determined by other scriptures and by the rule of faith. Now let me conclude with a theological observation or two. The church recognized the canon. It did not create the canon. As I've indicated, the language of the early writers is that these are the books we have received. The church did not see itself as creating the canon. And accepting a canon was not an act of authority over Scripture, but an act of submission to the authority of Scripture. And so to recognize the role of the church in recognizing the canon is not saying that the church had authority over the canon. It is simply to say that the church, in recognizing the canon, was submitting itself to the authority of these writings.